New D&D campaign with a new DM. At the very beginning of the first session, the characters got hired by a wizard who wants us to retrieve a magic key from a dungeon. The wizard insists on coming along, controlled by the DM as an NPC. We go to the dungeon and fight some monsters, find some traps, etc., but no magic key. It quickly becomes clear that the dungeon is packed with 7th level guess puzzle BS, and we keep opening hidden doors by doing stuff like putting the glass eye that we found in one room into the empty eye socket of a statue in another room, etc. We solve all kinds of puzzles to open all sorts of hidden doors over many hours, but still no magic key. The NPC wizard who hired us insists we keep looking. This goes on for 5 hours across multiple sessions. We eventually start saying, I don't know, maybe the key isn't really here? But each time the NPC wizard keeps insisting, we just keep searching more. Eventually, after 5 boring hours of this, the DM gets frustrated and tells us that we were supposed to realize that the key wasn't there and leave the dungeon so the story could progress. He has the nerve to act annoyed with us because we wasted so much time looking for the key that he told us to look for inside the pointless time-wasting puzzle funhouse of a dungeon that he designed. And when we pointed out that his NPC kept telling us to keep looking every time we were about to do what he wanted us to do and give up the search, he had the nerve to say, we weren't supposed to keep listening to him. I hit the eject button on that campaign. I was not expecting to get so heated during this reading, but I can think of multiple dungeon masters who would look at this puzzle and think, wow, I am so very clever, and then when it's actually implemented realize that it isn't actually that clever, and then blame the players instead of realizing that gotcha puzzles like this are stupid as hell. Disclaimer to begin with, I'm not entirely sure if this is a horror story as much as a tragedy, but I'll move this if you don't think it fits. Second of all, using a throwaway for reasons that will become clear. I have a good friend who's always been kind of an outgoing person, big on parties, being the center of attention, etc. Good to have around, but bordering on obnoxious sometimes. When the pandemic hit, he was stuck inside, and he asked me if he could join one of my games. I was kind of between campaigns at the time, but the request kind of inspired me to start one up again, if for no other reason than seeing him in a D&D context. He's not the kind of person you'd expect to do this. The week before the session starts, he and I are working out some kinks on his character, and he offhandedly mentions that he's aware he can be a bit much, and that he's read stories of the that guy and main character syndrome on the internet. If you are reading right now, hello. So he'll try his very best to dial it back. Privately, I was relieved, because there was a part of me with that fear, and I was hoping I wouldn't be the one to bring it up. The first warning sign was that his character he finalized was kind of, well, bland? It wasn't like him at all. I thought it was very strange. At the time, I thought he just wasn't super immersed in high fantasy, so he wasn't sure how to write it or what the tropes were. With hindsight, I think he was trying too hard to avoid main character syndrome stereotypes, so he replaced the cliche with a doormat. We ran this campaign sporadically over the next year, and he was a fairly consistent attendee. At first, I chalked up his withdrawn nature and bashful roleplay to him being new to this kind of game, but as it went on, he wasn't really improving. He was very polite, but only interacted the barest minimum, given only perfunctory answers and uncritically agreeing with everything the party said. On one occasion, I can recall he spoke up unprompted, and another player character, exceedingly in character and polite, rebuffed a suggestion of his, and he seemed to clam up and become excessively apologetic. At this point, I kind of picked up on the pattern of him purposefully avoiding having the spotlight and purposefully avoiding that guy stereotype. I would try to get him involved in some sessions by having NPCs address him or asking if he had any ideas. I had to dial that back when another player felt like I was showing too much favoritism to him. I didn't know what to tell him because all he was really doing was being polite, but no one in the world was this polite, least of all him. This was like certifiably polite. We had to take a lengthy break from the campaign because our schedules weren't working out, and in that time, he told me he'd probably dip out of the campaign because it wasn't working for him. I wanted to grab him by the arms and shake him and say it wasn't any fun because he wasn't making it any fun, but I couldn't think of any more polite ways to approach the subject, so I just let it go. I spoke to him just yesterday, and the D&D campaign, which is still ongoing, came up. With enough time passed, I had the courage to ask, what the hell happened? And he told me that he had psyched himself out. He said he saw way too much of himself in a lot of cringy stories, that he was forever on guard against it. He also said his recollection of the experience was much different, and that he left because he felt like he was veering too much into being that guy and making it too much about himself. Look, if you're on the sub, and you're reading this now, you know who you are. It's fine. We'd love to have you back. It's okay to let your hair down and be a bit cringe. If you ever cross a line, we can let you know politely. I still have your character sheet. I can update it for you. TLDR. New D&D player reads too many that guy stories, scares himself into being a complete non-entity at the table, and psychs himself out of playing because of it. I completely empathize with this anti-that guy because this was me. When I was running my first D&D campaign, I was listening to tons of those DMPC RPG horror stories, and I psyched myself out. I made NPCs purposefully non-factors in the campaign. I didn't make complex and interesting characters because I thought if I made a complex and interesting character, they would become a DMPC. And that was a horrible mistake. I was not having fun because I like writing interesting characters for my campaigns now. I really messed up during that first Curse of Strahd game and made everyone boring. This player is doing the same thing, but from the player perspective. And look, avoiding that guy behavior is really good, but don't psych yourself out. This is a sort of like imposter syndrome adjacent with Dungeons and Dragons. And while avoiding negative behavior is very good, this is not the way to do it. You shouldn't avoid negative behavior by making the game less fun for yourself. The point of D&D is to have fun, to engage, to create an epic story with your friends. These stories don't exist to scare you out of playing. They exist as cautionary tales so that you and your friends can have fun slaying monsters and telling epic stories together. After one or two adventures together, our party was contracted by the town guard to deal with some bandits who'd been ambushing travelers to and from the boonies. Walking along the road, they run into a camp of ne'er-do-wells. Rough-looking guys, the DM says, set up in tents along the side of the road. As the party approaches, the ruffians laugh at what was apparently a dirty joke. The party's face hails the men, who all get quiet all of a sudden. After some small talk, the face tells them that he and his fellows are looking for bandits troubling the road. One of the toughs, a gruff man with only one good eye, replies, "You don't say." Tension hangs in the air. "Yes," says the face. "Would you happen to know anything about that?" "What are you implying?" the one-eyed man answers. "Well," the face says, "if you've been camped here for a while, you've probably seen something, or maybe heard from some people who were attacked." The DM isn't sure where this is going. Face is being very friendly, and none of the players seem to be expecting a fight. DM asks for a perception check. Everyone passes, and DM tells them that these men look like real rough customers. Most of them have scars, all of them are wearing patchy leather armor, lethal-looking weapons, whom they all of them are armed with worn but lethal-looking weapons, which they also have their hands on, by the way. Most of them have recent cuts and superficial wounds, and all of them are keeping their eyes on the party. The face smiles, understanding what the DM is getting at, or so he thinks. "In fact, from the look of it, you seem to have had some trouble recently. Maybe a scuffle with these same bandits?" One Eye just stares, saying nothing but looking a little confused. "Since you're not dead, you obviously managed to drive them off, yes? Did you happen to see which way they fled?" Another party member cuts in. "If you help us find their hideout, we'll gladly give you a share of the reward." One Eye tells the party to hold on a second, then confers with his men out of the party's earshot. After a minute or so, One Eye comes back. "Yeah, we tussled with them. In fact, we know exactly where they're holed up. They're too tough for us, but by the look of you, you wouldn't have too much trouble. Come on, we'll show you." A quick hike takes the party and their new comrades into the woods to a cave on a hillside. A short distance inside the cave, they come to a rope bridge stretched across the chasm. One Eye tells the party to go first. There's trouble on the other side. The party does so. "Are the bandits close?" the face asked. "Very close," One Eye says. "In fact, they're right behind you." And the bandits cut the rope, collapsing the bridge and sending the party tumbling into the chasm, all while One Eye and his crew laughs. The players immediately call shenanigans on the DM. "What the hell?" the face says. "Why are they betraying us for the Why are they betraying us for the bandits?" Those were the bandits, the DM says. "Bullshit," says another player. "If they were bandits, why wouldn't they attack us on sight? You're just making shit up to punish us." "Why would they attack you?" the DM says. "They're bandits," the player replies. "It's what they do. They attack people on the road and take their stuff." Another player cuts in. "Yeah, it's a dick move, man. It feels like you just decided they were the bandits on the whim." Everybody is glaring at the DM. Everybody is pissed. "Look, bandits are like predators," the DM says. "They don't attack the strongest prey, but the weakest. The people who travel the road are small peddlers and farmers. You're mercenaries with weapons, armor, and magic. They're not going to pick a fight with you if they can avoid it." "Oh my god, you're just a garbage DM. How are we supposed to fight them if they want to attack us first?" "You could have attacked first, the DM says. You're working for the town guard, and they're obviously... Well, it's all the more reason why they would attack us, a player cuts in. The DM looks around in utter disbelief. He seems to be the only one at the table who finds it plausible for professional criminals to assess risks and exercise discretion. The DM quickly moves on, with the party landing at the bottom of the pit, forgetting about fall damage to mollify them. This segues into a dungeon crawl to get back to the surface. In the end, the players consider it a satisfying session, but to this day, they consider this incident to be a huge gaffe on the DM's part. They can't comprehend that Bandits could be anything other than an automaton who sees adventurers and flies into a homicidal rage to shake down a heavily armed party for a few coins to buy dinner. Heaven forbid that the NPCs be at least as intelligent as the players. TLDR, party fails to recognize obvious bandits because they don't attack immediately, get led into a trap, then blame the DM for making the bandits behave like they can actually think. There is an amazing Matt Colville running the game video where he talks about antagonists. More importantly, he talks about making antagonists intelligent, making antagonists who can think, antagonists who can take players hostage to extort the party for money. Stuff like that, he says, makes players really happy. It makes them realize that this isn't your average game. The bad guys can actually think. They act like human beings because they're being run by a human being. In my experience, that advice holds up. Players usually love it when antagonists act like smart, thinking creatures. I guess this party is the exception to that rule. I have no idea why they're so opposed to antagonists thinking in a clever manner. The DM clearly gave them plenty of opportunities to succeed in this situation. I do understand that there are hostile DMs out there who take advantage of gotcha situations to screw over the party, but that's clearly not what we're looking at here. It's just a real shame because this situation might dissuade the DM from using intelligent and thinking antagonists in the future, and I think the party is really missing out on an aspect of D&D that makes the game special. D&D 5th edition, our DM had something new planned for us, a murder mystery for our party to solve. We were excited, but that excitement soon turned to frustration. Now let me preface this by saying that I don't entirely blame our DM for this disaster. Mystery stories are notoriously hard to write, requiring a careful balance between doling out enough clues to keep things exciting, but not revealing the solution too soon. Turn this into an interactive play session with 4 players, each with their own strengths and weaknesses, playing 4 characters with their own skills, then account for things like magic existing, so someone could, for example, cast Speak with Dead and ask the victim who killed them. It's a structural nightmare. Anyway, the mayor had sent our party to investigate a murder on a cargo ship. When we arrived, we were greeted by a member of the crew, who informed us the captain had been found dead in his cabin that morning. Our first course of action was to investigate the scene of the crime. After a fruitless searching of the cabin for clues, our druid somehow figured out the murder weapon by gouging the shape of the stab wound in the captain's back, an exotic dagger rarely seen in this region. Our first lead, we thought. Interrogating the crew gave us our second apparent lead. One of the sailors implied he knew more, but he told us to meet at the local tavern that night so he could speak freely. So we spent the afternoon and evening figuring out how to proceed with the murder weapon thread. We visit the local arms dealer and blacksmith, ask them questions with no result, check the library for books and exotic weaponry, and when they didn't pay off, just randomly started asking people around town. We had apparently hit a dead end, but at least we could still talk to the crew member. However, for some reason at the tavern, the sailor played completely dumb, seemingly not knowing anything about the crime and refusing to answer any questions. We tried buying him drinks, offering him money, but he clammed up shut. Annoyed at this apparent flip-flopping, I tried to intimidate him into telling us what he knew. I rolled an intimidation check, and I got a natural 20, so then the DM described how I scared the sailor so much, he jumped up and bolted out of the door. We tried to follow, but he had already disappeared into the night. Frustrated, we went to bed for the night. The next day was a lot of aimless wandering around town, going back to the ship for more interrogations, and searching other rooms on the boat, like the first mate's cabin, with no success. We found no new clues, got no new information, and were getting bored out of our minds. We ended the second night going to bed with nothing accomplished. Then, a doppelganger killed us all in our sleep. So what the hell happened? Well, as our DM explained it, he had expected us to find the first clue in the first mate's cabin, which would have led us to a new location with the second clue, and go from there. Ultimately, it would have been revealed that the doppelganger had killed the captain by disguising himself as his first mate, hired by a business rival. But wait, we had checked the first mate's cabin on day 2 and found nothing, right? Well, that's because the DM had written it so that the doppelganger went back to the ship to clean up the evidence, meaning the clue was gone on the second day. And the murder weapon? Just a red herring. So to summarize, we got stuck at the very start of a murder mystery because the only clue was in a different location from the crime scene, which was timed to disappear after a day, leaving 0 ways to make progress. Then we get insta-killed after wandering around for a whole day. Look, I do empathize with the DM, and I do understand what the OP is saying when it's not entirely the DM's fault. However, this situation is so incredibly, ridiculously bad that it's hard not to completely blame the DM for this absolute BS. First and foremost, there is a very simple principle to have when you're doing a mystery. Look, DMs out there, if you want a satisfying mystery, here's my trick. Where the party is looking, if they give a clever enough reason, or they're looking in a spot that makes sense, just have the clue be there. You don't need to give them the solution the first time every time, but eventually just let them find it, even if it's not what you had in mind. This DM was being borderline hostile. Having the clue disappear is nothing short of lame, and the insta-kill doppelganger, come on, that is just cheap. I'm not saying to make progress easy, but if your party are struggling and they come up with a clever solution, even if it's not what you had in mind, let that be the solution. Reward the party for clever thinking, especially if it's more clever than what you came up with. I've had to do this multiple times. This happened decades ago, but I only recently became aware of this subreddit, and I thought maybe there would be a few people out there who would enjoy the story. My one and only experience while actually playing TTRPGs was when I was a freshman in college. Our group consisted of 5 people. Dave the DM, myself the rogue, Paul the fighter, and the problem player, Alex the wizard, and Bob the monk. Paul was the only one of us who lived off campus at the time, so we'd usually meet at his house to play. At first, Paul was perfectly fine to play with. Over time, though, he started to do more and more to push the rest of us aside and make himself the center of attention. In the first instance I can think of, he had just found a small locked box containing the cure to a plague that was affecting a local town. I said, I pick up the box, or at least that's what I was about to say. I got as far as blank before Paul jumped in with, I smashed the box. Dave asked him if he was sure about that, and several other players asked him to, not do that. I even told him that I had lockpicks, like right here, but he was adamant, and so he succeeded in smashing the box, scattering the powdered medicine all over the room, ruining it. After that, he began to do more and more to draw attention to himself. Once we were meeting an informant at a tavern. Naturally, Paul the fighter didn't have much to do, so he randomly went over to the biggest, burliest guy in the tavern and tried to pick his pocket. This failed, kicking off a bar brawl and ruining our chance to get information from this informant. Towards the end of the campaign, this would even extend to his in-real-life behavior. When someone else was narrating what they were doing, he'd randomly interrupt to ask some pointless question or other, or he'd randomly roll his dice for no reason, or even yawn loudly. Anything to draw attention to himself. Since Paul was the host, we'd all agreed from the beginning that the rest of us would take turns providing the snacks. One session, he brought food anyway, just so he could then whine about how much it cost. I didn't want to seem ungrateful for free food, especially as a student, but hearing him complain over and over and over again about money when nobody asked him to buy anything in the first place, well, it really began getting tiring after a while. Also, he hadn't told anyone he was going to do this, so the guy that was supposed to provide food that day, Dave, if I remember, had already bought food, so didn't actually save anything through his generosity. It all came to a head at the end of the year. This was going to be our last session for the semester, so we could all concentrate on studying for the finals. We were setting up, and the conversation mostly revolved around said finals. Alex, one of the other players, casually mentioned that the test he was most concerned about was already behind him. He had already been working on his pilot's license, and had just taken his check ride, and was now a fully licensed private pilot. As you might expect, this completely derailed the conversation. We were all amazed and plied him with questions about being a pilot and flying in planes in general. Well, all of us except Paul, who kept telling us to hurry up and start the game, even though we were still setting up as we were talking. Paul then started regaling us with stories about how his grandfather had been a fighter pilot in World War II and how he knew a guy that was a pilot for a major airline. When that didn't succeed in taking the tension away from Alex, he told everyone that he'd been in a major plane crash and had been lucky to escape with his life. This worked out for us because the place Alex rented at only had 2- and 4-seater planes available, so if there had been 5 of us, Alex would have had to take us up in shifts. Hearing that only made Paul grumpier. Now, to understand this next part, you need to know that the FAA draws a sharp line between flying for fun and flying for profit. With certain exceptions, a private pilot isn't allowed to charge for their services, and in fact, must pay their fair share of flying expenses. Of course, back then, it would be a lot harder for an ordinary individual to know that. The internet wasn't exactly what it is now, and the FAA didn't routinely publish all its rules on their website like they do today. So the only way to know was if you read through a physical copy of the rulebook, or if someone had explained it to you. For instance, if you were listening to it when a pilot was explaining the rules to some friends that he was planning a pleasure flight with. I'm sure you see where this is going. Our first week back, Alex told me he was under investigation by the FAA. Somebody claimed we had paid him for our little flight. We each had to go to the FAA office and testified that we hadn't paid Alex anything. Of course, we all suspected who had done it, but we had no proof. That is, until we found out that Paul had been telling our little circle of friends that Alex had lost his license. Alex said he hadn't told Paul about the investigation, so the only way he'd even suspect that Alex might be in trouble was if he'd been the one to make the false report. This was confirmed when Alex and I, and some other friends, were eating lunch one day and he walked up, the first time we'd seen him since the end of our last semester, and smugly asked Alex what it was like being grounded like the rest of us plebeians. We all stopped being Paul's friend, and the FAA would go on to dismiss the case against Alex for lack of evidence. This isn't so much of an RPG horror story as this is a real-life horror story. I know it may be crazy to some people that someone would go to this lengths for bitterness around RPG main character syndrome and someone stealing the spotlight through getting a pilot's license, but trust me, there are absolutely people out there who would do this. I have unfortunately seen this firsthand, and it is really nasty. Honestly, this kind of behavior is unacceptable. Going back to D&D for a second, main character syndrome can be incredibly disruptive. It's important to talk to other players and ask, hey, are you getting enough spotlight? Do you feel like my character is taking up too much time in the game? Etc, etc. You don't need to be overly paranoid about it, but just checking every now and then, especially when you're having a lot of scenes, is a good idea. That is something that Paul would never ever do. Someone being extroverted and just talking a lot because that's their nature is way, way different from somebody going into D&D with the intention to be the main character, going into D&D with the want to be the center of attention. That is borderline malicious, and something that will ruin both games and, in this case, friendships. And that is where we're going to end today's episode of RPG Horror Stories. If you guys enjoyed it, then please do leave a like. If you want to see more of my content, then you can check out our Roll for Insight podcast, where I interview dungeon masters, YouTubers, authors, and get their opinions on all things D&D. And while you're there in the card, subscribe to Crispy's Tavern to get more of our content as it comes out. And finally, if you want to leave your own stories or thoughts, go down into the comments down below. If you cannot think of a comment, leave the comment, not the law, to let me know you made it to the end of the video. In essence, like, comment, subscribe. I am going to go watch Season 2 of Primal tonight. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I will see you all next time. Farewell.